Is this what it sounds like when a war ends? The families of the remaining hostages and people in Gaza welcoming the announcement of a ceasefire and the beginning of a longer-term plan for peace and reconstruction of what has become a nightmare place. But we've had ceasefires and hostage releases before, and then the death and destruction has resumed. And why is so much more hope being invested in this pretty complicated-sounding plan? And what's actually in it? Step into the briefing room and together we'll find out. First, what's left of Gaza? To what extent, after 2 years of bombing and fighting, is it a functioning region? Here with me is Rushdie Abu-Alof, BBC Gaza correspondent, now based in Turkey. Rushdie, we've all seen the images or heard the descriptions of the destruction in Gaza. You witnessed some of it for yourself. It's hard to get a grasp on whether anything could possibly be working in a situation like that, or anything still functions. Can you tell us which areas of Gaza have suffered the most destruction, and are there any areas that have been relatively unaffected?
So if we divide Gaza into 3 areas, the most affected area is far south. Rafah is almost completely destroyed. Then less destruction in the north, about maybe 80-70% in some area, 80% in other area. And then the middle, which include the 2-3 camps and Deir al-Balah city, is about 90% of the buildings and infrastructure are still standing.
What proportion of the population do we estimate is displaced? In other words, can no longer and is no longer living in the place they were living in before October 7th?
About 40% of the people, they are unable to go back to their places, completely displaced. Just to make it easier, we are talking about Rafah, where about 150,000 people used to live. It's completely empty. No one is in Rafah, which is in the border with Egypt. Half of the population used to live in Gaza City and the north, about 900,000 people in Gaza City, and about 300 or 400,000 people in the north. There is only 300,000 people almost left within these areas. The rest of the population are displaced to a place called Al-Mawasi. It's near the coastal area in the west of Khan Yunis. And this Al-Mawasi area is like the size 4-3 times of Heathrow Airport, where now about 1 million people, they live on top of each other in this area.
Now, do the homes people have been displaced from still exist? In other words, could they conceivably go back to something?
Not for sure, because it is very complicated, because people, when there was a ceasefire back in January and people were allowed to go back to their homes in the north, like over 50% of the homes were gone by this time. But people were trying to repair like one room out of a semi-destroyed building and live in it. So the people would prefer to go back to their original places, even if it's destroyed, so they can set up a tent in a neighborhood that relatively familiar to them.
When I look at pictures of the destruction in Gaza, it's very hard to believe that you could still have an operating electricity system, an operating sewage system and so on. Can you tell us what has happened to those critical amenities? Do they still exist in some places?
The system is collapsed almost a month after the 7th of October. The infrastructure for the electricity is destroyed. The head of the electricity distribution company said back in last March that 95% of the infrastructure for the electricity is completely gone. Gaza before 7th of October, 95% of the water was contaminated with either sewage or seawater, according to the UN. So people used to buy clean water even before 7th of October. Now there is no even contaminated water is not reaching the homes that still exist. So for example, if you open the tap in the kitchen or in the bathroom, there is no running water.
The other thing one wonders is how they get the money to buy anything at all. Are banks still operating? Are people still able to earn money?
Israel used to allow cash into Gaza. Since 7th of October, Israel did not allow any cash into Gaza. So people buy the cash Whoever is having cash now is sell it for about 30%, fee. So, for example, if I want to send like $100 to my father in Gaza, I do the bank transfer to his account. Then he does bank transfer to the dealer or trader or whatever they call it, and then he give you the cash after he deduct like 30%, sometimes 40%, sometimes 55%. It depends on the availability of cash.
What jobs do people have? Are their businesses still open?
Since 7th of October, more than 70% of the businesses were shut. Shops, factories, small manufacturing companies, everything was shut.
Let's talk about schools and hospitals now. What proportion of schools are still standing, still have staff, still operating?
There is no definite number about how many schools are left, but quite recently, back when the school year started, the UN said about 65 to 70% of the school were destroyed. The rest is being used by displaced people as a shelter.
What's the situation with hospitals and healthcare?
Well, according to the Hamas-run health ministry, they said it used to be about 55 hospital and medical center across Gaza Strip, and now there is only 7 out of them are functioning. But if we talk about the main hospital, we are talking about Shifa Hospital as an example. This hospital is now functioning 10% of its capacity.
What about the police?
There is no police system in Gaza. I have never seen Gaza has this level of criminals and people looting houses, looting even the aid trucks. Other main problem is that now there is 5 gangs distributed across Gaza. They have like automatic rifles, they have 4x4 cars. They belong to a strong, powerful clan in Gaza.
Finally, let's just talk about administration. Is there really an effective administration still in Gaza?
Well, not really. Everything is collapsed. I mean, the system is collapsed. The society is collapsed in Gaza. And there is no power, there is no authority to run anything in Gaza.
Rushdie Abu-Alof. Next, where has the current peace plan come from? And what's in it? Sir Lawrence Freedman is Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. Where did this plan come from?
First, a lot of people have been developing plans for the day after. It's been clear from the start that you had to have some sort of situation in Gaza in which neither Hamas nor Israel were in charge if you were going to produce any sort of lasting resolution to the conflict. Israel couldn't come up with a plan because it's divided itself, and if it did, then it's not clear that it would have been anything that would have been acceptable to the Palestinians or the wider international community. It had to come from somewhere else. The American administration doesn't really have the capacity. Biden had developed some ideas, but this is a new administration. So the source, which may surprise some, was the Tony Blair Institute, which had been working on this in London for some time. Blair knows the Middle East. He spent a lot of time there, not necessarily successfully, one might think, but he does know the major players and knows the issues. And importantly, his ideas didn't involve the large-scale expulsion of Palestinians, which is what many feared. So it was acceptable to Arabs. Once it was embraced by Trump, and this seems to have come through his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who was his envoy in his first term, who had worked with Blair. So once they had a plan, Israel was then going to find it quite difficult to oppose it because Israel has burnt so many of its international bridges. It really has only the US left as supporting it. So if Trump was backing it, it would be difficult for Israel to disavow it.
Now, this is going to surprise a lot of people who are astonished that Tony Blair is involved in any way, don't really know what the Tony Blair Institute is, and would wonder why it managed to come up with a plan that no one else had.
And it's almost impossible that this Israeli government could come up with a plan that would be at all acceptable, not only to the Palestinians, but to the Gulf states. The Gulf states are absolutely key to anything moving forward and to getting this far. Blair has good relations with the Gulf states. They help fund his institute. And Trump cares more about the views of the Gulf states than he does about Palestinians. But so it all really depended on them. And of course, Blair spent a lot of time. I mean, people may not feel it was that productive, but not only as prime minister. After he left as prime minister, he was part of the contact group trying to see if there was a way forward on the Middle East. So he knows the area and he knows the people. He's got a good network. So these can be pluses and minuses, but he's not a complete outsider when it comes to this sort of role. And I think there wasn't the same urgency on this matter in the Trump administration, really, I'd argue, until the Israeli strike on Doha on the 9th of September, which infuriated everybody.
And just to remind people, Laurie, that attack by Israel on Doha, on Qatar, was to take out some Hamas figures who were living there.
Well, I mean, the attack on Doha on the 9th of September was taking out the Hamas negotiating team, the people who were actually considering the ceasefire proposal that Israel had spoken to the Qataris about. It meant that Qatar, who had served as an intermediary, felt violated because of this attack. And it, I think, stirred the Trump team into action, both to reassure the Qataris that they didn't want them to abandon the mediation role and that they would make sure Israel didn't do it again.
Now, Lawrence, could you just take us through what the main components of the plan are?
The first stage is whatever happened, you'd need a starting point that was the release of hostages and an end to hostilities, which is to get the hostages released in return for a reasonably limited Israeli withdrawal, essentially back to where they were a couple of months ago. Then somehow you've got to get in a stabilization force made up, one assumes, largely of the armed forces of Arab countries, maybe some other Muslim countries as well. And then the introduction of a transitional government. Both of these must oversee the next stage of decommissioning Hamas's weapons.
Right, so the critical forces that need to be brought on side are, one, Hamas needs to disarm, right?
Yeah.
Which it has to agree to. Two, the Arab states have to agree for a stabilisation force, and I presume to put in a whole lot of money in order to get the thing working.
Yes, I mean, the reason that the Gulf states absolutely have to be there is they're the only ones who are going to provide the resources for the reconstruction of Gaza, which is an immense task, as one can imagine. And then quite a complicated structure of administration, largely technocratic, with an overseeing board of which Trump is to be chairman, not because I suspect he's going to do a lot of work, but because the Arab governments are nervous that Israel will find any excuse to wriggle out of their own commitments, and they assume Trump is the best person to keep Israel on the straight and narrow on this. And then over time, the Palestinian Authority is expected to reform itself, including getting a fresh leadership, dealing with corruption and so on. And then at some point, when we see how this is going, you've got the rudiments of a Palestinian state. Then it offers the Palestinians the prospect of some reconstruction, of decent governance, with the possibility of a Palestinian state at the end of it, though this is something Israel is very much resisting. But anyway, that's down the road.
Sir Lawrence Freedman. And before we move on, a plug for the Briefing Room podcast. If you visit BBC Sounds, you can access the entire back catalogue. Some of the episodes have been rendered obsolete by time and events, but a surprising number are still relevant, such as the one on what is the European Court of Human Rights and what does it do, or the one on digital ID. Back to Gaza. Lawrence Freedman outlined the plan and who and what it involves. But are they really up for it? And what are the biggest obstacles? I'm joined by David Makovsky, Director of the Programme on Arab-Israel Relations at the Washington Institute of Near East Policy, and Dr. Sanam Vakil, who's the Director of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. Sanam Vakil, we've heard from Lawrence Freedman why Israel has finally agreed to this deal, but why has Hamas agreed to it now?
Well, Hamas has been under enormous military, humanitarian, and political pressure, not just over the past 2 years, but even over the past 6 months. Its military capacity, of course, is decapitated, and its leadership has also been eliminated by Israel. It's a consensus-based body, so it's still operational and certainly has been negotiating over the past week or so. But it's aware that its population in Gaza is desperate for relief and an end to a war. And this deal, even though it is a limited deal for now, secures a major concession, release of Palestinian prisoners, potentially high-profile ones, while keeping Hamas politically relevant. And effectively, it buys Hamas time, preserves some leverage, and makes it clear that Hamas is still part of this conversation.
Right. Let's now go into the deal itself, the longer term parts of the deal as well. Now, hostage and prisoner release is the first stage. Can we talk about what will be the problems in moving beyond that? Withdrawal, disarmament, setting up an administrative authority, rebuilding Gaza, the full thing. And the thing that I'm wondering, David Makovsky, is when you look at the stakeholders, how committed they are to seeing a plan like this through. And if you start with the United States and the Israelis and tell me your assessment of their commitment.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think what's clear is for the president, he is very much identified. This is the Trump peace initiative, and he does not want it to kind of end with a fizzle after it starts with a sizzle. He would like, I think, to see it through. He would like to expand to do his dream, which was a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal. He knows it's not possible right now. So I do think he's willing to stick with it for a while, but clearly the back burner of this, not the front burners. The front burner, was a very defined agenda, which is stopping the war, releasing the prisoners, the hostages, the humanitarian trucks, the initial withdrawal line. I think the issues are going to get tougher on the back end of will Hamas really demilitarize?
Right. So that brings me on a question about the Israelis. Some people might worry that after the hostages have been released, then the government of Netanyahu may look for any excuse to say Hamas has not lived up to its part of the deal and that therefore it doesn't have to go through with the rest of what is in this agreement.
Well, it's a good question. Israel would, I'm sure, if you were asking their people that question, they would say, hey, the deal talks about demilitarization. Clearly, if Hamas is willing to demilitarize, give over their weapons, blow up their tunnels and their weapons, depots and the like, it's much better to do it with an international force so Hamas doesn't lose face. That's the good case scenario. But the bad case scenario is, they got their prisoners out. They got, 250 lifetime prisoners. They got 1,700, detainees. The war is stopped. They might say, well, we've lost interest in this. And then Israel will say, okay, can this ISF, this multinational force, really demilitarize Hamas against its will? That's where is going to be the toughest question, because the pressure on Israel to stay and to do the demilitarization itself will grow strong. If Hamas is willing to demilitarize, better Israel stays out of the way. But if it's not, I think the pressure on Israel to stay in at least parts of Gaza will be very strong.
Salam Vakil, can you tell me about what you think the commitment of the Arab states is and what the expectation of Palestinians beyond Hamas may be?
Sure. First of all, regional states, including Turkey, but also other Arab states, and I believe Indonesia has also been part of these discussions, are very keen to see this war come to an end. They've been worried about the spillover, the politicization among their own populations. And so they have been really instrumental in pressuring from behind the scenes and also proposing their own plans that have, of course, been absorbed as part of this 20-point framework that is currently on the table. What we do know is that the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis may contribute funds and provide that sort of military support for this stabilization force. But, the real devil here is in the details. We just don't have the details.
David, let's talk about the administration. We talked about the stabilisation force a bit, but let's talk about the administration point. In addition to a stabilisation force, people actually have to get in there and run things, and that is going to be difficult as well. Now, the whole thing is under the aegis of this board, apparently of which Trump will be the chairman, but I imagine he will be he'll be a chairman rather than the CEO. What about the administration? What about the commitment of the Americans and the Israelis and others towards building that administration?
Look, I think that is the potential good side of all this, that should be less complex because, the idea is a technocratic administration made up of Palestinian experts, hopefully from Gaza itself. I assume some from the West Bank, maybe some from abroad. But this is like going to be the test case. Can a non-Hamas body run it? Israel's fear has been that there would be what they call the Hezbollah model of the past, where sometimes Hezbollah doesn't have to run the government, but in the Middle East, the people who fire the shots call the shots. So if this body is truly pragmatic, technocratic, and could bring good governance, that's all upside for everybody. And I think that's what the hope is. I personally think there'll have to be some affiliation with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, but there's a lot of political sensitivities to that in Israel, that this government doesn't want the PA to come to Gaza. And, I think that's mistaken, but I think that's their view. So I tend to think the PA, they'll be affiliated, but the actual bureaucrats running it will be seen as independent of it.
Sana Vakil, this strikes me as being a potentially big sticking point because, as I understand it, and we've done programs about this previously, one of the last things that the Netanyahu government has wanted has been to give credibility and power to the Palestinian Authority, not least because it could be the bit of Palestine of the Palestinian entity which is recognised when people say they recognise a Palestinian state. How much of a problem do you think this is going to be?
Yeah, this is certainly another one of the big problems out there. I would also say there is a big collision to be had over the end of this process, which, again, Arab states envisage a Palestinian state to emerge. And, of course, the Israeli side of things, and Netanyahu himself, pretend that isn't part of the deal. But, very clearly here, I think the governance issue is huge, not just for Hamas, but for the Palestinian Authority and for Palestinians more broadly. We don't talk enough about their agency in this process or lack thereof. And any sort of reform needs to have sort of legitimacy from the governed. And there is no discussion of how Palestinians themselves can be brought into that process. But, I think Arabs would like to see a reformed Palestinian Authority over time, stepping in to take over the control of Gaza and the West Bank together. While President Abbas has pledged elections, Hamas's participation is unclear. These red lines really need to be ironed out. I think another sticking point, if I throw that in there, is everyone talks about a demilitarized Palestinian state and Palestine not having agency or control over its own security basically embeds asymmetries in the relationship that are very similar to the asymmetries put in place under Oslo.
The Oslo Agreement of 1994, which saw Yitzhak Rabin and Arafat make an agreement.
Yes, sorry for that. And that will, those asymmetries over time can threaten the sustainability of all of these phases and the long-term objectives of a permanent peace settlement.
Okay, time to put our courage to the sticking point, or whatever it is. Actually, I kind of think of a new phrase of this for that. It's tricky to make a judgment here, David, but are we right in being more hopeful than we've been at any previous time in the last 2 years that maybe we've got a way out of this?
Yes, I mean, it's clearly the most hopeful moment in 2 years because, Gaza at least has a chance now. I mean, a lot of the things that the world has wanted is in this deal. It is that, bring this war to an end, get the hostages out, bring in surge of humanitarian assistance, create a plan for reconstructing Gaza that is not being led by Hamas. These are all things that the world has been praying for. And I think there's at least a chance now. I mean, I'm afraid, to get hopes up, but, this is clearly the best moment in 2 years.
Sanam Vakil, what's your optimism quotient like?
I'm optimistic that we'll see this first phase through. I mean, there's certainly momentum and international and regional support, and I think domestic support in Israel and Palestine for this process. People deserve to live in peace, and this has been a horrendous 2 years. I'm worried about the next phases, and I hope that, again, the international community and regional leaders are going to have unity, will work together, will have the attention span and the continued discipline to see this process through, because that's really what it's needed. And Donald Trump's engagement is going to be really essential to bridge the gaps that will continue to divide both sides.
You've been listening to The Briefing Room with me, David Aaronovitch. The producers were Cordelia Hemming, Kirsty Knight and Charlotte MacDonald. The sound engineers were Neva Messirian and Dave O'Neill. The editor is Richard Varden. Another edition of this podcast will be along again very soon.
The figure's face was featureless, and its entire body was jet black.
I'm Danny Robbins, and throughout October, I will be sharing Uncanny Listeners, real-life ghost stories. That's one every single day as we count down to the spookiest time of the year.
Suddenly, all hell lets loose. The sound of glass smashing, heavy objects being thrown, doors being ripped off hinges. It was coming from the cellar. I looked up and was staggered to see a humongous black triangle floating silently over the rooftops.
Join me as Uncanny counts down to Halloween every day in October on BBC Sounds.